da boo, la ba da boo, la ba da boo da boo. La ba da boo, la ba da boo, la ba da boo da boo.
I've had some really good professional development opportunities in the last week, and one of them was going to a talk by Nicholas Van Dam, who's the director of the Contemplative Studies Center at the University of Melbourne. And he's done a bunch of research, including with Willoughby Britton from Brown University and the Cheetah House organization. And I think the title was Mindfulness and Meditation, Aspects of Harm and Help, or something like that. And it just really tied into what we're talking about here, and especially in terms of culturally informed teaching and the adverse effects of meditation. So I just want to throw a couple facts at you that I got from this seminar. First of all, people may or may not realize that many people are turning to mindfulness and meditation instead of mental health interventions. Sometimes people do some therapy and do mindfulness and meditation as part of that. But there are a lot of people who don't have access to mental health services who are turning to mindfulness and meditation. And this is concerning because, as I think I've mentioned before, there are now multiple studies that show about 1 in 10 people who meditate for less than an hour a day they experience adverse effects, up to and including functional impairment of a month or more, including like psychosis and depersonalization, derealization, anxiety. There's all kinds of potential adverse effects. And 1 in 10 is not a small number. In the US, we're talking about 60.5 million people, 60.5 million people who meditate, and 10% of those people are having adverse effects. And adverse here means unintended, unpleasant, and having a negative impact on the individual's well-being or daily functioning. So we have that. Those who are most at risk are 4 things. Those with experience in retreats. I fall into that category. Those with elevated psychological distress. So note, I just mentioned there's a lot of people turning to mindfulness and meditation because they can't get mental health help. Those with high psychoticism, unusual or eccentric patterns of thinking and perceiving reality. And those who hold unusual beliefs and experiences. That's holding beliefs or experiences that are unconventional or atypical. So those are some of the main risk factors. People don't generally report these experiences spontaneously on their own. It's actually less than 1%. And if we ask, as practitioners, as teachers, if we ask, have you had a distressing, unpleasant, or unexpected experience in your meditation, then we see about 25% of people saying yes. So 1% will spontaneously report. If we ask, we get about 25%. If we develop a questionnaire with the most common adverse effects listed, the rate of people who report having one or more of those experiences jumps to 50%.
Wow.
So again, people are turning to meditation and mindfulness instead of mental health interventions. And 75 to 80% of mental health professionals are suggesting mindfulness and meditation to their patients. So their perception of the risks may not have caught up to the data here. And Van Dam actually cited Batchelor in his talk. And he particularly referred to the idea of the Eightfold Path and the complete mindfulness, complete livelihood instead of right. And that idea being that mindfulness was never intended to be used on its own. Mindfulness and meditation are one of the aspects of the Eightfold Path. And it's definitely the case that when you teach mindfulness and meditation within a person's cultural context, you reduce the likelihood of adverse effects. Adverse effects are more likely when you try to teach it out of their cultural context. So as he said, culturally informed care is key.
Definitely gets me thinking about how to play the most effective role I can in sharing these tools that I've learned and having them actually be of benefit to people. I don't know.
I mean, I might, if I had to sum up what this book is about, I might actually say just like a culturally informed approach to Buddhism. like
Right. Right.
like
Right.
trying to
Yeah.
bring
Yeah.
it here
Yeah.
today.
And I mean, that's definitely the part that makes good sense to me. Basically, that kind of approach is what I'm sharing with people, like on Sunday, like having that kind of just open dialogue approach that's pretty much based on simple sitting practice is my way of not introducing too much like outside of our cultural context. I
Yeah.
mean, but the thing is that people are interested in all of this and frequently I think want more depth. I think one thing that comes to mind for me with all this is it's revealing to me maybe things that I haven't totally processed about my own experience with all this stuff
Ditto.
because I hear all that and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. That kind of really speaks to where I'm at now in terms of the process that I'm going through to bring my practice together with modern secular life.
Yeah.
And so it makes a lot of sense to me. And at the same time, it brings up just this kind of like weird feeling that is based on recognizing that I went through a lot of, on a certain level, hardship, although it didn't really feel like that at the time, I mean, but made a sort of extraordinary effort to connect with Dharma way outside of our cultural context, you know? And it went well overall. Like to me, like I feel like it was a successful venture. Like I started a process that is still ongoing. And, um, it's funny because someone at the meditation group yesterday just asked, sometimes they'll ask me some really personal questions,
Uh-huh.
so I leave it open to that and I do my best with that. But, basically he was like asking, do I feel like 3-year retreat specifically was worth it? Was it worth it?
Mhm.
And I said, yes, definitely. And kind of thought about it for a minute. And I would still say that doing that retreat is actually the most meaningful thing I've done in my whole life. I would still say that today. And
Likewise. Yeah.
I was kind of laughing yesterday because it was like it's funny that I still would say that because there've been so many shifts and twists in the path or journey or whatever, but like I would still say that's true and like I feel like it gave me the opportunity through the process of starting all these practices to really appreciate life, and I think it increased my appetite for life, which to some more orthodox or conservative minded practitioners, that might sound like exactly the wrong thing to have happened, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's not what I think. And I'm saying that in a very specific way, like I think it's good to have an appetite for life. And so, anyway, these are all points that actually, funny enough, came out in our discussion yesterday. Like, I was asked, did all of the activities that I've become involved with after retreat, were those skills that I had found newly after retreat? Or was it that my appetite I'm involved with so many things now because my appetite to develop talents or do things had somehow increased since then? And I answered definitely the second one. It's the experience of really wanting to just like dig into everything, so anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but my point is that I guess my own personal journey, which included many of the unrecommendable elements from this point of view, right, was good fundamentally. It had struggle for sure, and like maybe was like somehow risky, but it like went well overall, I would say, or it started a worthwhile process. And so sometimes when I hear all this stuff, I think it makes me, I have to do a little bit of work to separate myself and my own experience from all of the information. And I think that's been a challenge with this book too, realizing that it's not necessarily like a challenge in like a antagonistic way to my experience, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think I turned to mindfulness and meditation, or like, I guess ultimately at that time it was religious philosophy, essentially, because
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't developed a practice yet. But I turned to religion instead of other more conventional methods to sort of work with, you know, a high level of anxiety at one point in my life. Like, I'm talking about, was getting done with school. I wasn't very happy. I had a lot of reasons to be a lot, you know, a lot of the same things I'm doing now. I was playing in a band that was pretty good and had a lot of things going well, but I just wasn't very happy, you know, and was experiencing a lot of anxiety. And I think ultimately kind of turned to this stuff instead of more conventional avenues of treatment, which may have brought with it a certain level of hardship or struggle. But I, in retrospect, kind of find myself like not regretting it. But that just may mean that my level of mental unwellness was not so pronounced that it couldn't be addressed this way. You know what I mean? Like, because obviously
Mm.
there's probably, you know, there's examples where it really is not doable. But anyway, I don't know. It's tough. Like, sometimes I find myself feeling like maybe I don't know how to speak to all this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is like a space this book put me in, and it sounds like it may be similar to you, which is like part of the reason why I think it's great teaching is he doesn't give you a thing to hang your hat on. You know, like just when you
Hmm.
think he's saying like the whole monastic system is wrong, he's like, oh no, but there's actually really good reasons for this. You know, so I mean, it's like it's constantly like just balancing, you know, and putting you in that space of like not being able to get certain or stop or stagnate, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think if it's arguing against anything, it's that sort of like either or stagnation. You know, like this is what I do, or
Right.
that's not what I do, or you know, this should be this way and it should never be that way. And it's a little uncomfortable. I mean, and I think that's the whole point. And I think where one of the places where I landed, especially after this chapter, is I started to think like, should there be, you know, informed consent is like a new concept and not new, but it's in modern life. Like that's a thing that we do. We try to make sure that people are informed about what they're getting into, what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, and then we give them agency to decide. And it got me really thinking about should there not be more informed consent in the teaching of the Dharma? Not just as it relates to mindfulness and meditation, because I think that's important for sure, but
Mm-hmm.
also as it relates to other cultural beliefs. We'll get into this more when we get into the book here, but like there were a number of things that I didn't know I didn't have to believe. You know, I spent a long time like
Mm-hmm.
kind of just repressing, you know, questions or things that I didn't ever really believe because I thought it was the Dharma, you know, and I needed to believe it
Mm-hmm.
and I was doing it wrong if I wasn't believing it. And so I think that maybe this idea of informed consent should be something we're thinking about more in places where the Dharma is taught, because I think there's no small percentage of what comes to us through Buddhist institutions, especially Tibetan Buddhist institutions, that is significantly driven by the wish to preserve a culture that is seen to be under threat of eradication. And that is at least a strong motivation, if not an equally big motivation, as achieving enlightenment. So should we not be
Mm-hmm.
honest with people up front and often after the first time that this cultural preservation aspect is a part of what we're teaching and it is not the Dharma, you know, and that you
Right.
can put things in baskets and understand like this part, you know, is something you really have to work with. But if you don't believe this, that's understandable. But this is the cultural vehicle that these teachings came to us on through. And so this is how we're presenting them to you. But don't worry if it doesn't resonate or if you can't buy into that,
Yeah. Yeah.
because how many people have had challenges with their practice of Dharma and meditation in large part because they conflated a different cultures and traditions and norms with Dharma. Like I
Mm-hmm.
know that was my
Mm-hmm.
case. Like I know so many things I felt were my own failings or lack of progress on the path were just, I thought that they were the Dharma, but they're cultural stuff, that weren't
Right.
necessary for me to think or believe.
Yeah.
So I think best case, it's just an unnecessary feeling of challenge or lack of success. But worst case, some of these people are ending up in mental institutions, literally, with
Yeah.
anxiety and
Yeah.
psychosis and dissociation and all these things. And that's, in no small part because we're not informing people, and we're not letting people know there are risks. We're not letting people know that what we're teaching them is not expected to be their new culture. It's actually just a package that the Dharma is coming in. So I'm not against teaching another culture as a vehicle for the Dharma at all, and I
Mm-hmm.
deeply value my experience in retreat and all of my teachers and everything that's come down to me. I'm lucky to have access to all of these things, but we need to be more upfront with people about the risks entailed in this stuff, the challenges it can bring, and we should give everyone an option to learn Dharma in their own cultural context if we really want to help all beings find their way to enlightenment safely and without unnecessary challenges.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know exactly how that looks,
Um,
but it's something I'm going to be kind of
right.
pondering. Like, how do I maybe put in a 2 or 3 sentence, standardized paragraph, some sort of informed consent thing, every
Yeah.
time I teach.
Yeah. Another aspect of all this that just comes to mind right now for me is like just the wide range of different people that come to the door wanting to practice something or wanting to connect with this thing called Buddhism, and like this approach to the Dharma that we're discussing in the context of this book, or we could probably just say the approach to the Dharma that you and I basically teach is not really going to be for everybody. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? And it also might, according to some people, this would be like a sort of lazy approach. You know what I mean? A way to kind of say, oh well, like it's, you don't have to change that much, like,
Mm-hmm. I see what you mean.
like
Yeah.
that kind of like like loosey goosey,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, and like maybe it is okay, but that debate doesn't really occur to me so much anymore, like whether it is or isn't. But my point is just that, like, you could maybe criticize our approach from that point of view. There's just so many ways to take all this stuff. Like some practitioners are going to find it more valuable to have the idea of nirvana and the positive results of practice as this far off thing that they're moving toward, or like essentially an escape from suffering. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? It takes a certain level of intelligence and discernment to synthesize all of the subtleties involved with this stuff and come to the kind of practical application of a view that he's expounding in a book like this. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
not going to really be, it's not going to be for everybody. You know what I mean? So my point of saying that is just that like there's still got to be all of these options available somehow, I think,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So then it's kind of like maybe everything's just okay, like
Well, but
as
that's
it
the
is.
informed consent part that I mean, though. You know what I mean? I don't mean cut
Yeah,
it out, but I mean, like, anything you're
right,
going to do,
right.
just make sure people know exactly what it is you're doing.
Yeah,
And really
yeah.
just the clarification of, what's essential and what's maybe irrelevant, you know?
Right, 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 right. But if you tell, that's what kind of what I mean though. If you tell people that up front, like you might be telling them that the very thing that they need the most is actually irrelevant,
But
you
shouldn't they
know?
get to decide? I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of the
Well,
whole
but I mean,
point of informed consent, though, right? Like,
yeah. Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, it's hard to say what's irrelevant, I guess. Some of that stuff is irrelevant from this point of view, you know?
yeah.
I mean, somebody might consider this book irrelevant, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, my view is there's no danger in putting information in people's hands. Like, I think there is an element of sneakiness, I guess, about some of this stuff that is well intentioned. Like I don't think
Mm,
anybody's being nefarious about this stuff, but I do think that I think there needs to be more openness about these frameworks, because particularly to come back to the content of this chapter, like there's a lot that's developed over time because of cultures or specific situations at a certain point in time. And just as like an individual may sometimes need to think of nirvana as a destination they're working towards over a long arc of practice, similarly, they may at another point need to think of it as imminent, right here, something they can taste. And
right. Yeah, yeah.
likewise, cultures, at some point in time, maybe need strong monastic institutions, while as other times they may need strong individuals. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it's better if we're moving in a direction of more clarity and thoroughness in sharing the elements of what we're teaching. And then, like, I would never want to not give someone an option because I think they should do the option I'm giving them. And I'm afraid if I give them the other option, they won't do the thing I'm giving them.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, that's true. I do think there's an element of that involved with the way Tibetan Buddhism is presented.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not presented like here's all the options that are available to you. Do the one that you want. Usually,
I mean, it's in there.
uh,
I think it's ultimately always in this stuff. But when it gets to the human teachers, I think sometimes the scared parts or the parts that don't want to seem, authentic or not legitimate in the eyes of this, idea of
right.
the lineage that extends back and above them into, forever into space. You know what I mean? There's a lot of weight with
Yeah,
that. And I think a lot of times the human side starts to get entrenched and want to, like, rather than
right.
being person centered, thinking about the person they're teaching at that point in time, they want to think about themselves, and what works for them or what their teacher said. And it's hard to turn towards the person that you're working with or talking to and really connect with who they are right now and what they need. That's a tricky spot, just like this book is a tricky spot for us. It's uncertain
Hmm.
and it's changing, and what it is today may not be what it is tomorrow. But I think that's maybe the root of the problem is that, we generally meet these teachings through teachers, and all of those teachers, including you and I, are always struggling with our own junk. And
Right.
I think if we just move more towards, and I see like person-centered and informed consent is like related here, like I think there's a way to make those things match and not lose anything, of the Dharma in the
Hmm.
process.
Hmm. What I just had come up in my mind is that I think that one thing that impedes authenticity is too much of a sense of self-importance,
Hey,
actually,
hallelujah. Yeah.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
and even just in small ways. And like part of what I mean is like sometimes it's hard to be authentic if you're taking yourself too seriously and you think that a lot of what happens is somehow up to you. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
We might hesitate to answer a student's probing personal question candidly from what we really think from our own experience because we think if I tell them the wrong thing too soon or something, it may not be good for them, all that kind of stuff. Like as if so much is up to us, which I really think is just bullshit, honestly. Like we need to answer questions honestly from our own experience and like have some faith,
Mm-hmm.
that it's gonna be okay. Like
Yeah.
maybe they're asking you that question in that moment for a reason, because you're
Mm-hmm.
someone who can actually speak to what they really are wondering about. I kind of think that extends beyond just like the Dharma context too, though. You know what I mean? Just everyday life. Like
Yes.
what do we really have to hide, and why are we being so serious? You know?
Yeah. And each of our journeys and successes and failures and all of that, that's our riches. You know, that's I think that's a big part of my own personal journey
Mhm.
now, is just recognizing, like, to your point, like I really have been thinking lately about how I have made those attempts of like being the teacher, you know, and putting on the
Right, right.
facade of the teacher, you know, and done it poorly, because that's not who I am. You know what I mean? I'm not saying I can't teach, but I'm saying, like, it was a departure from authenticity. It was a departure from being myself, and it was stifling valuable experiences and ideas. And you know, I just recognize more and more how it really is the student who is either, it's kind of like, you know, two keys on a piano. You know, you hit two keys and they're
Mhm.
going to harmonize or they're going to have some dissonance, and there's maybe differing
Mhm.
degrees, but
Mhm.
like, I'm one key
Right.
and the student is another key. And you know, maybe the two keys harmonize, and that's great, and we want to hang out there for a while. Sometimes that key, you know, that may change and it may actually make some dissonance. And at that point,
Right.
maybe that's bad, maybe that's good, maybe that's exactly what we need, who knows. But if I'm not being my own tone, you know, if I'm not in the moment
Mhm.
playing the tone that is me, then I'm really not giving anything to the student, because they're their own tone. You know, I
Right.
hope this analogy makes sense, but like, if we're not being who we
Yeah.
are,
Yeah.
we're really not sharing what's of value.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think another thing is just that people don't understand what you're saying if you don't speak authentically. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like, I'm thinking of, like, when you're talking about putting on the costume of the teacher,
mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? And, like, saying the things that you think you should say, like, you can be smart enough to just give a good teaching according to what should be said, but people don't really connect with it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because it's not really coming from your own actual experience, you know? It's like, I feel like I've definitely been engaged in a process of sort of learning how to translate all of this more and more, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that kinda makes me think too, there's something in the background of all this conversation where it's like, we haven't yet seen institutions develop or organizations develop based on the kind of approach to Dharma that we're talking about. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, maybe that's our work, and I don't know what that'll look like, and personally, like, I don't necessarily even think it's quite time to do it yet for me. But at some point, it may be the case that we have to establish centers that present the Dharma in this way. The reason I think that is because hope there always will be, like, traditional monasteries where people can go connect with Dharma too, right? But it's like, a lot of my experience is extracting the essential points of all of that that make sense and actually have personal impact and value for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was taking something out of all of that, and the specific rituals and symbolism and imagery of all that. It does strike a chord with me,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it, you know. But that might not strike a chord with everybody, and that's okay. But in order to address the need here, that means that people who have extracted this view from all that probably need to make their own places or something. I don't know.
Build their own cities, to use the analogy.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you know, it's funny to say that because then part of me is immediately like, well, isn't that just starting the whole process over again? You know, like, maybe we shouldn't have institutions, you know?
But I mean, isn't
But
it, maybe that's exactly what he's talking about though, is like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We just have to go back to
mhm,
what Gautama taught, you know, which is
mhm, mhm.
individualized. You know, it's in your own experience. It looks all kinds of different ways. Like, we'll get to reading those 10 theses of secular Buddhism, but like, that's maybe where we've gone astray, is to say like, this is how it is, you know, like,
Right.
And maybe that kind of language just needs to go away and say, like, today I'm teaching from this view, you know, and I'm going to, like, another thing is like, so I was thinking about this informed consent thing. I want to write up a quick thing about the informed consent, about the cultural aspects. And then I want to follow that with a quick positionality statement. Have you heard that phrase before? That's like a new thing that's happening. I've seen it in academia and professional development, but a positionality statement is you just say who you are and where you're coming from. You know, like, so we might say, like, you know, you know, obviously I'm a white male, you know, I come from some degree of privilege, and, you know, went to college, you know, you just tell people your perspective, where you're coming from, you know, like, what are the key things that are informing where you're coming from, so people know what you're delivering and who's delivering it, and, you know, what all that is. Because then maybe you say, well, I'm not a white man and I don't have privilege, and, you know, but that doesn't mean I can't listen to this person, but I need to be aware that it's coming to me through that lens, you know? And so
Right.
I think in that way, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could even, maybe in just 2 paragraphs at the beginning of a teaching, empower people to find the Dharma, you know, through their own lens, you know, and not be confused by the overlay of our own experiences or positionality, you know, like not confusing that with the Dharma. Maybe that's the key kind of thing, is confusing individual views with the teaching, the core teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
And in that way, you're also enable people to have their own view, and they recognize, like, oh, okay, well, I can be who I am. I can bring me to this fully, you know?
Right. I like that. It kind of puts everything in like an open playing field too. I mean, it like takes the pressure off the situation, maybe on both sides, because if I say something about myself, and even if it's just as simple as like, look, you know, I've been practicing Dharma that I learned from this tradition for a long time, and the teaching that you're getting is basically my own translation of those core principles based on my own experience, what I think is important, you know. So take it or leave it, kind of, or like, don't feel any pressure to like accept this as a definitive account of what Buddhism is. You know, this is kind of one approach.
Yeah. And your positionality statement could change over time. Like, I feel like right now I would probably say, and right now in my life, I tend to be teaching a lot from the perspective of the, you know, the unity perspective, you know, the idea that, like, nirvana is not separate, you know, it is, you know, present and available to you right now. But there are a lot of people who find value in seeing nirvana as this far away thing that we're working towards slowly. And it's not that one or the other is correct, or that you have to pick one and stick with it forever. It's about knowing that those are options available to you and starting to be able to discern which one you need in a given moment, so that you're not just picking the easy one. You're picking the one that's going to help you grow and flourish. And I'm just telling you where I'm coming from right now. I'm kind of in this spot of unity, you know, and I'm not in that spot because it's easy or lazy. I'm in that spot because there's where I have trouble, you know, and so I'm trying to work with that because that part's challenging to me. So that's where my mind is at, and where I'm exploring the Dharma. And you can, you know, take any of these options, and you should always be aware, if you're picking a thing, what's the other thing, you know, and start to see what those things feel like. You know, if you try those 2 things on, just don't ever get entrenched or mired in one or the other.
Yeah.
A lot to think about.